Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 234 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by Advanced Compliance Solutions, your one-stop shop for all things FCPA compliance related. Today I have back my good friend and colleague Matt Kelly. Matt and I are getting ready to found a joint podcast, so this will be really the first in a series that we're going to do entitled Kelly and Fox Into the Weeds, and we named it that because we wanted to have a podcast where we could really get granular on a couple of topics per podcast. So in this first podcast, we're going to take a look at whistleblower hotlines, anti-retaliation programs, and then the new ISO 3137001 anti-bribery, anti-corruption policy and program standards. The episode comes in at just over 26 minutes. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for listening. I'm Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have back with me Matt Kelly, the founding director of Radical Compliance, and Matt and I are going to do something I think we both wanted to do for a while, which is start a joint podcast. So although I'm going to post this on my site, this will probably be at least an introduction to our podcast, which we are going to call Compliance in the Weeds, because we both wanted to have a forum to really get into some granularity. So with that, Matt, welcome, and I hope you survived the weekend cold snap.
Hello, Tom. It is great to be back. And, just for any listeners out there, Sunday, Valentine's Day, was the coldest day in Boston in 60 years. We had -8 Fahrenheit when I woke up that morning, and of course, true to Boston as well, the very next day it was 55 here. But we have survived, and I am intact, so it's great to be back.
Well, good. Matt, you've had a couple of recent posts that really intrigued me, and I wanted to see if maybe we could explore those at some length. The first one was entitled Whistleblower Hotlines and Anti-Retaliation Programs, and you started off by taking a look at a recent benchmarking report by Conversant and Ethisphere about the issue, and really use that as a starting point to start to explore what does it mean to have a hotline and how do you measure it. So why don't you go from there?
Yeah, sure. So that was the spark in my mind, was that Conversant Ethisphere report. I think it was published at the end of January. They were talking about metrics that compliance officers use to gauge effectiveness, because all the surveys always ask that question, and it is an important thing to do. But they had found that 81% of their respondents cited hotline statistics as a metric they use for the effectiveness of their program. And it kind of set me off to talk about what do we actually mean when we say hotline statistics. And I think a lot of compliance officers would probably know the dilemma here that having a lot of calls to your hotline is not necessarily a bad thing. That could indicate a very strong speak-up culture, which is good, even if they're complaining about a lot of things. And conversely, you could have no calls to your hotline. That would be a very bad thing because you have no idea if things are running well or everything's running terribly, but people are too scared to speak up, which is just not at all what compliance officers would want. So I kind of got on a riff about what useful hotline statistics there would be. And I think the key point is that you do want a lot of calls to your hotline, reports to HR, reports to managers. You want that sort of information because it is the raw material from which you would refine and draw out some useful conclusions. But to have no calls at all, that's bad because you have no idea what's going on. Good, bad, or otherwise, you are in the dark. But assuming you do have a lot of reports to study, the reports themselves, just having a lot, doesn't tell you anything because other than just the volume of activity. What you really need to get to is data about each call or report itself, like information about the information. And I know that's a bit of an eye roller, but what I had been getting to in my column was that when you think about it, statistics about calls specifically regarding retaliation. Those are important. Whether that is the absolute number of retaliation complaints you get or the relative percentage, 20% of all your calls are about retaliation, 80% are about something else. Are the retaliation complaints against one manager or multiple managers, or is it fluctuating year over year and by how much? That's the sort of analysis that you want to get at for a good hotline analysis, because it drives you closer to the question, how is your culture? And that's really what I think is important there. You could, for example, have a lot of metrics that say we're getting retaliation about complaints about one specific manager. So you have one very specific bad problem, and you have to solve it. But that's very different than we're getting a whole bunch of complaints about a whole bunch of managers. That indicates more of a culture problem, and your ethics and compliance message isn't sinking in. You might have problems with training, but you need that sort of analysis because you have to have the answer to that question. Rest assured, regulators, if they're ever knocking on your door, they're going to be asking about culture, not what's the total number of hotline statistics. So that's where that point came from there. Just some musings over what we actually would want behind that hotline statistics phrase.
And Matt, in the second part of this blog post, you talk about anti-retaliation programs. But before we get to that, I really want to pick up on that part. And you really summed it up for me with a question, or perhaps two questions you ended that part of the blog post with, which were, how is our culture and does it respect ethics and compliance? And when I read that article, I actually was reading that around the time I read an article in the Harvard Business Review called, Can Your Employees Really Speak Freely? And that really, your point that you ended with in both your remarks and then your blog post that I quoted, really summed up for me what these authors were trying to get across. And they said that, or at least the problem they saw with hotlines was the employees had two reasons not to use it. One was fear of retaliation, which you touched on. But a second one I thought was equally insightful, and that was the lack of responsiveness. And they really used those 2 points to lay out a framework for helping a company think through a hotline as one tool in a part of their overall culture. So they suggested things such as make feedback a regular, casual exchange so that the compliance officer would provide feedback to employees, not just when they called through the hotline, but certainly when that happened, put employees in a place where they could have a sort of conversation, I don't want to say in a safe place, but in an open environment. Second was to be transparent. And I really thought that you hit that in reporting on the hotline, because if you're not transparent, that incredibly frustrates employees. And really the best example I can think of was a couple of years ago, or maybe several years ago now, at Compliance Week. I sat in on a panel of trade compliance, and there was a representative from the Department of Justice on the panel. And the first question was from the audience, and the person said, you may not remember me, but 6 years ago I came to you with a anonymous whistleblower complaint, and I've heard nothing since then. So, of course, the DOJ officer was put back a little on his heels, and he said, well, it's ongoing, I can't discuss it, blah, blah, blah. But the point I got was this guy had said something 6 years ago and had got no feedback or transparency.
Yes.
So any thoughts on those? Not
that I wrote about those specific issues in this post, but I do agree with the general points there. And some other statistics I have seen about whistleblower program management is that generally a compliance officer has 2 shots with the whistleblower who reports to the hotline. They will call once, and then if you're lucky, they will call again. If they don't hear anything back, they'll call again just to basically say, what happened? Am I still here or not? If you don't respond, certainly by the second, they are almost guaranteed to say, well, these guys don't care. I might as well go call a plaintiff lawyer a shareholder activist, the Department of Justice, anybody. You've lost them. I think that what the Business Review article was getting at about making discussion sort of an ongoing thing, it's very similar to, in the HR department, we all talk about annual performance reviews, which everybody hates. Everybody hates to get them. Everybody hates to do them. And everybody always says, wouldn't it be better if we just casually met with our boss every month or 6 weeks just to have a checkup on what's going on and how am I doing, and not this air of formality that intimidates people. I agree with that on the HR side, but I think that dynamic about taking the mystique and the threat and the sort of imperial nature of a big formal investigation and complaint, taking that away and humanizing it, it does well for the employees, does well for the compliance officer who doesn't look like Dr. No, and I know you're a big fan of using that metaphor, how to remove that. I think those are excellent points to try and get at if you can as a compliance officer.
Well, and I guess I would say it's not so much being Dr. No, it's being the person who communicates the process. And if the process is, we've looked at it, here's what we found, we need additional information, I'm sorry, without additional information we can't go forward, or directing someone to, if it's more of an HR type issue, is being that sort of transparency and helping the employee to navigate the whatever roadmap they're on. But really, like your point on, you got two shots, basically. And if you don't respond, and I think we've probably both seen the similar statistics that say 75, 80, or maybe even higher percentage of people have gone to the company first before they go to an outside regulator or other outside body. And it's just not, that lack of responsiveness can kill the effectiveness of not only a hotline program, but a corporate culture as well.
Yeah. And, the other point that I would maybe pick up on, where we say 75 to 80% of employees report to the company first. I don't know this for a fact, but I'd love to get some clarity on whether the employee thinks he's gone to the company and the company thinks he or she has gone to the company. And I would bet that there's some disconnect there, that, for many employees, going to your boss is going to the company. And the compliance officer might never know that the employee went to the boss. There's no formal process there. And it gets to more of a point that you really need to train the managers on, be on the lookout for what going to the company actually is. And when it happens, please let us know. And, because I certainly would not be surprised if there were employees who said, oh, yeah, I went to the company many times, and the company would sit around saying, we had no idea this actually had happened. We didn't know that's what you were doing when you told us whatever you said. And to think through those kind of elements to the problem, I think that would be also a very wise practice.
So really, kind of going back to your original point, is this is a tool, hotline is a tool, but it's only a tool. And it's one important part of your overall indicia of your culture, but it's only a part. So I really like the way that you've taken that and talked about it in that context, which leads me to part 2 of your blog post, where you talk about anti-retaliation programs. And probably for most compliance practitioners, they have not yet heard that OSHA is working on guidance for whistleblowers. So why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, first, credit where credit is due. The person who tipped me off to this was Joe Murphy, the well-known compliance consultant and often at Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics events. Joe had dropped me a note informally that OSHA is working on this guidance. It is guidance for anti-retaliation programs. The initial plan from OSHA, and it's just a draft right now, that was published for public comment in November. I do believe the comment period has already closed, but I suspect truly passionate people could probably send in a comment to OSHA anyways. And OSHA is looking to get a final adopted plan later on this year. I've given a look at that plan, and the headlines of what OSHA is proposing are not shocking. Ensure leadership commitment, foster anti-retaliation culture, implement a reporting system, conduct training. This is not news to anybody who's listening to this podcast, I'm sure, and that any self-respecting compliance program isn't already doing. I think one question that will not be settled for quite some time is, once this guidance comes out, how will regulators interpret it when they are looking at your anti-retaliation program? And will this be sort of a blueprint, or, dare I say the dread word, will it be a checklist that the regulators might use to look at your anti-retaliation program? In the training, for example, OSHA actually lists 10 specific points that it wants training programs about anti-retaliation to cover. So what if you cover only 7? What if you cover 3? What if you have your own set of very important 10 points? Are you right or wrong, and how will all this be interpreted? Nobody knows, but the OSHA guidance is floating around out there. Like I said, still in draft form, but if you go and you look it up on their website, you can give it a read, and just an issue to be observed this year as OSHA moves towards some final guidance that I suspect will adopt by probably the fourth quarter.
Very interesting. I like, or rather, unfortunately, since it was generally out of the compliance officers or compliance professionals' radar, we may not get a lot of comments on this, but your point is very well taken that the dreaded checklist may come along at a very least a minimum of things that companies should consider. So it will be interesting to see what their final comments or final program might be. And for those who would like to take a look at it, Matt has conveniently provided the link on his blog post. Once again, the blog post is entitled Whistleblower Hotlines and Anti-Retaliation Programs on Radical Compliance. Well, Matt, if we could change the subject a bit, you also had a blog post on another very interesting topic, and I think something that's going to hopefully have a lot more comment from the compliance professionals, and that is the new ISO, or at least proposed ISO 37001 standard for anti-bribery compliance. And you have a blog post, amazingly enough, entitled Anti-Bribery Compliance. Don't forget ISO 37001. So why don't you tell us what 37001 is and why we should be thinking about it?
Well, sure. For U.S. compliance officers, what is it? This is the ISO version of that, which you largely already do. So no U.S. compliance officers should be thinking, oh boy, am I going to have to redevelop my whole program if I want to be ISO compliant? No, you do not. There may be some fine points around the end, but most of ISO 37001 is basically, it is a roadmap for a good anti-bribery management system that almost to a T seems to mimic every basic anti-bribery program element you have today. So, training, preventive and detective controls, risk assessment, tone at the top, anonymous reporting, everything that we would expect, that's in there. The ISO standard even looks at prohibiting bribery on the policy side, which is really about saying this is a crime, don't do it, and talks about how bribery should be thwarted by strong financial systems and internal controls, which is the books and records side. So really, this is just the International Standards Organization trying to, I guess, codify what U.S. compliance programs have already been sort of in the vanguard of doing in developing anti-bribery programs. ISO 37001 has been floating around as an idea since 2013. The draft, which it now is open for public comment. You do have to buy a copy of the draft. It's only about $60 US. And they are looking for comments, and then ISO hopes to publish a final version by the end of 2016. Since I wrote that, I did have a few people comment in that many people U.S. compliance officers might think, well, if this is what I'm doing, then what's this big deal to me? It's a somewhat big deal to U.S. compliance officers for two reasons. First, if you use ISO standards for other parts of your business, and if you're in management or like manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, software, or whatnot, if you have a big quality assurance function in your business, probably the QA people are using some ISO standards elsewhere. And ISO standards are designed and are perceived by the quality assurance world to kind of snap in together. So that if you're already ISO, I think it's ISO 19,000, that's for
Right.
management systems. If you're already ISO 19,000 compliant, this is, I don't want to oversimplify it by saying they're like Lego blocks, but, many people have said that, this is going to be just part and parcel of it, and that's how you can sell anti-corruption programs to the quality assurance guys who might already use, hey, we're an ISO shop, this is just one more ISO standard I'm going to adopt. Happens to look and feel exactly like how we've already run compliance for the last 5 years, so no big deal. There's some office politics arguments that ISO will help you make. The other point that I would be curious to see over time is if third parties of the world out there, particularly in emerging markets, might look to use the ISO standard as some sort of seal of approval for anti-bribery efforts they themselves have. Right. ISO standards are designed to be auditable, so therefore some third party in Africa can stand up, say I'm 37001 compliant, you can come and audit me, and you have a more confidence in the third party that you're doing business with. So maybe ISO would help alleviate these third party risk challenges that drive compliance officers endlessly crazy. And then, certainly
let me stop you there, if I could, because I've also heard one other, if not criticism, critique along the lines of the following, that having a written standard for certification of compliance programs is a very dangerous message, that it truly is tick the box, and that once you get ISO certified, it's going to actually lessen compliance going forward. Any thoughts one way or the other on that critique?
Well, it's a valid point to raise, but I would say the people who should be pushing standards of excellence, frankly, it is up to the regulators to really set expectations on how vigorously you want anti-corruption to go. And I to be clear, I think we should always be looking to improve anti-corruption efforts. But at some point, you still have the day job of actually doing business and making money at your company. And, the company has to be aware of that. And it's okay, I would say, to, take a breather at the best possible level for a while others, such as ISO, such as you and me, such as the Justice Department, and other big thinkers of the world, take a step back and think about how can we now take anti-bribery to the next level of excellence, and then, kind of go from there. Without something like ISO to help address third-party risks, or what's the minimum standards or expectations, like what is the alternative to help people understand what they should do? I would also put it that way. Better to have a standard you can certify against than to have no standard and no commonality at all, which doesn't give businesses the certainty they need that they can try some other risk management efforts, they can actually do business, and get on with the job that they've chosen to do, which is, to make money and sell products and services and whatnot. So I don't mean to say that we can settle, but I do mean to say, you need the foundation somewhere, and that's what this is. It's a foundation. So there's no harm and nothing wrong with standing on it.
One of the things that, or I guess a couple of thoughts from your piece, Matt. One was, as you said in your remarks there, that the standards themselves are really not going to have too much new, and certainly nothing that the compliance professional has not previously seen. But it does include some things that typically we don't see, at least in an FCPA compliance program. And the first one is a discussion of inbound bribery.
Yes.
Or bribes of your employees. There is also some language around facilitation payments, and those are debated, at least in the U.S. compliance arena, somewhat. But my question is, by having this language around inbound bribery, do you think that puts too much on the plate of a compliance practitioner in the United States?
No. I think, first we should all keep in mind that the ISO standard is optional to adopt. There's no force of law requiring anybody to do this. It may be a good idea to adopt. It may be a good idea to adopt some or all of it or parts of it. But certainly it's a good thing for ISO to mention that inbound bribery is still a problem, which, to be honest, we often do not think about it because inbound bribery is not how this gets enforced. We don't often stop to think that we ourselves are somebody else's third party. Every bribe you pay is inbound bribe to somebody else, and we're only liable for outbound bribery. There are a host of problems. If you have inbound bribery, you might be at risk for embezzlement or intellectual property theft or who knows what. It's already a concern businesses have. They just may not necessarily be addressing it in terms of inbound bribery. If somebody is bribing your chief engineer to leak the designs for your next product, while it may be bribery in one sense for the board, for the general counsel, for everybody else, it's intellectual property theft and it's piracy, and they worry about that. They already do worry about it. What's the impetus for the employee to commit the misconduct? It may be bribery by some outside party, but I don't think it's too much for the company to worry about. Companies do worry about it. It's just the ISO put an interesting phrasing around it, or made me see it from a different perspective. I think we don't often stop to appreciate. I put it that way.
Well, Matt, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time. For those who haven't checked out his website, it's radicalcompliance.com. It's got some great resources and some very insightful articles. But if someone wanted to get in touch with you to find out more about what you're doing these days, how would they do so?
Sure. Well, they can always look me up on email. I'm at mkelly, and that's spelled Kelly, mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. And I also am floating around on Twitter most of the time. That is Compliance Meme is my handle, and you're certainly welcome to follow me and send me a message there as well. And it's always happy to be on these podcasts with you, Tom, and always happy to hear from some other people. So if you guys have something to say about the blog and what I'm doing, let me know.
And at the very least, you've got to check out the website because there's a wonderful picture with Matt and his new boss. So I found on the About page. So very good.
I will let that go unspoken, and people can go investigate it for themselves.
Well, Matt, thanks a lot, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in the weeds.
All right. Thank you, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have two calls to action for you. The first one is if you have any questions you would like explored on an upcoming podcast, either with myself or Matt Kelly, please email them to me. We're developing a mailbag episode. The second call to action is if you're in the New York or New Jersey or greater tri-state area, I'm putting on an FCPA Masterclass on March 7th and 8th at the offices of Merrill Corporation in New York City. You can get more information on it by going to my website, Advanced Compliance Solution. That's advancedcompliancesol.com, or you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox, and I thank you very much for listening.